At 0300 hours local time, a Ukrainian strike drone, roughly the size of a small car, lifted off from a hidden launch strip near Mykolaiv and climbed into the darkness. At the same moment, across 4 separate regions of southern Ukraine, 38 others left the ground from tree lines, gutted warehouses, and fields that had been quietly prepared weeks earlier. What Russia's air defense network over Crimea did not know, and would not find out until it was already far too late, was that this swarm had not been launched to catch a squadron of fighter jets in the air. It had been launched to catch them exactly where Ukraine wanted them, sitting still on the ground, freshly landed, fully fueled, and completely unaware that the very night they arrived to reinforce Crimea would be the last night most of them ever flew again. The target was Belbek Air Base near Sevastopol, and the reason Ukrainian intelligence had picked this particular night went back nearly 2 weeks. Ukrainian Defense Intelligence, the GUR, had been tracking a squadron of 12 Su-35S fighters being pulled from a base near Rostov and quietly repositioned to Crimea, part of a broader effort to rebuild Russian air cover over the peninsula after a string of earlier losses. Ukrainian scouts embedded near the departure airfield, along with signals intercepts monitoring routine transport and fuel logistics chatter, had already confirmed the squadron's approximate transfer window nearly 4 days in advance. Ground-based observers near the departure base reported the exact number of fuel bowsers being staged for the jets 2 days before takeoff, a detail that let Ukrainian analysts calculate almost precisely how far the aircraft could fly before needing to land, which narrowed the list of plausible destination airfields down to just 3: Belbek, Saky, and Decoy. Belbek's longer runway and its proximity to Sevastopol's naval logistics hub made it the most likely choice, and Ukrainian reconnaissance assets were quietly repositioned to watch it around the clock, starting 3 nights before the transfer actually happened. What Ukraine did not yet know was the exact night the jets would actually land, and that uncertainty was the entire reason this had to be a waiting game rather than a rushed strike. A fighter jet caught mid-flight is nearly impossible to kill with a slow attack drone. A fighter jet sitting on a ramp, wings folded, fuel tanks full, canopy open while ground crews finish their post-flight checks is one of the most vulnerable machines in the entire Russian arsenal. So Ukraine waited, kept its drones fueled and ready at multiple dispersed launch sites, and simply watched the sky over Belbek every single night until the transfer finally happened. It happened tonight. At 0140 hours local time, the 12 Su-35S touched down in 3 waves of 4 aircraft each, exactly as Ukrainian reconnaissance had predicted based on the fuel load each jet would need to make the transit safely. Within the hour, all 12 aircraft were parked on the eastern apron, canopies open, ground crews moving between them with fuel trucks and munitions carts, beginning the routine post-flight servicing that every squadron performs after a long transfer flight. It was, from a purely technical standpoint, the single most vulnerable moment those aircraft would experience in weeks. And 25 miles away, a Ukrainian observation team already had eyes on exactly that moment, watching it unfold in real time through a high-altitude relay drone holding position well outside the range of Belbek's own short-range defenses. The mathematics behind the decision to strike immediately, rather than waiting for daylight or a better window, was brutal and simple. A single Su-35S cost Russia somewhere in the range of $45 to $65 million to build, and represents months of pilot training invested in the crew flying it. Destroying even 4 or 5 of these aircraft while they sat exposed on the ramp would inflict more damage to Russian air power over Crimea in a single night than weeks of contested air-to-air engagements ever could. And every hour those jets remained parked, fueled, and undefended by anything other than Belbek's standing air defense umbrella was an hour Ukraine could not afford to waste. At 0300 hours local time, the full swarm of 39 UAVs crossed into contested airspace north of the peninsula, and Russia's early warning radar network came alive almost immediately. This was not a quiet, undefended stretch of coastline. Belbek sat behind one of the densest concentrations of layered air defense anywhere in occupied Crimea, and every layer of it activated within minutes. An S-350 Vityaz battery, stationed roughly 12 miles north of the base, picked up the leading edge of the formation first, and just as it had during previous nights of failed interceptions elsewhere on the peninsula, the radar picture told an ugly story before a single missile left its rail. 14 of the 39 UAVs were carrying small radar reflectors bolted to their airframes, a cheap piece of hardware that made a $6,000 airframe glow on Russian screens like an incoming cruise missile worth 100 times more. They flew high, held tight formation, and did everything possible to look exactly like the threat Russian doctrine had trained every crew in the region to fear most. The S-350 crew did not hesitate. 4 9M96E2 interceptor missiles, each one weighing roughly 850 pounds and costing close to $2 million, streaked off their rails within the first 90 seconds. 3 decoys were torn apart in midair almost immediately, and Ukrainian observation teams watching the same thermal feed simply logged the losses and moved on, because every one of those decoys existing for exactly this reason. Somewhere in a command bunker outside Kyiv, someone was trading a piece of scrap composite worth less than a used car for a fraction of a multi-million-dollar missile inventory, and it was the best exchange rate of the entire war. Over the next 6 minutes, the S-350 battery expended 11 more interceptors chasing the decoy formation, destroying 9 of the 14 and losing track of the rest as they scattered low over the tree line north of the base. While Russian radar operators congratulated themselves on breaking up what looked like the leading wave of a serious cruise missile raid, the real strike package was already past them. 25 of the 39 UAVs had never carried reflectors at all. They flew low, under 200 feet, holding no fixed formation, transmitting nothing beyond the bare minimum telemetry needed to stay coordinated, and blending into the same ground clutter, tree lines, and coastal terrain that had swallowed low-flying UAVs on this peninsula before. On the S-350 screen, they did not look like an attack. They looked like noise. It took almost 9 minutes before a junior radar operator noticed that several of the tracks, previously dismissed as ground clutter, were moving in a straight line, holding a consistent heading and closing steadily on Belbek's perimeter. By the time that report reached anyone with the authority to redirect the battery's remaining missiles, the low formation had already covered nearly 4 miles of additional ground, more than enough distance to slip past the outer edge of the S-350's effective intercept envelope entirely. Belbek's own point defense systems, a pair of Pantsir S-1 batteries, positioned to protect the runway and parking apron directly, picked up the low formation next, and this was where Ukraine expected the real fight to happen. Each Pantsir carried 12 57E6 missiles, capable of reaching targets moving at more than 1,000 meters per second, along with twin 30mm 2A38M automatic cannons, firing nearly 5,000 rounds per minute combined. Against a formation of slow, low-flying UAVs with no evasive capability, a Pantsir battery is normally close to unbeatable. But Ukraine had not sent this formation in blind. As the Pantsir's 1RS-2-1E fire control radar locked onto the leading edge of the group, the UAVs nearest the front activated digital radio frequency memory jamming pods carried specifically for this moment, intercepting the Pantsir's own radar pulses, subtly altering the range and velocity data, and retransmitting a distorted echo back toward the receiver. Within seconds, the Eastern Pantsir's screen went from tracking 9 real targets to displaying more than 30, some appearing to accelerate impossibly fast, others splitting into multiple overlapping signals, a handful showing up miles from where any actual UAV could physically be. The Pantsir crew fired anyway. 4 missiles in the first salvo and 2 genuine hits were confirmed as real UAVs vanished from the low formation in bursts of orange light. But the other 2 missiles chased ghost signals that were never there to begin with, burning through nearly $600,000 worth of interceptors on targets that did not exist. A second salvo followed only seconds later, and this time, just 1 UAV was confirmed destroyed. The confusion bought the surviving formation exactly what it needed, a handful of critical seconds, to close the remaining distance while the Pantsir's fire control system struggled to separate real threats from electronic noise generated by aircraft that individually cost less than the fuel used to fly a single training sortie. By the time the Pantsir crews abandoned missile engagement and switched to their 30mm cannons, the range had closed to less than a mile, and the UAVs were flying low and erratically enough that even the devastating volume of cannon fire struggled to find consistent hits. Tracer rounds tore through the dark in wide arcs, catching 2 more UAVs and shredding them into falling debris. But the formation kept coming, weaving low across the last open field before the base perimeter fence. This was the moment Ukrainian planners had built the entire strike package around. 2 UAVs suddenly broke formation and climbed hard to nearly 1,500 feet, radar signatures blooming instantly clear and unmistakable against the night sky. Both Pantsir radars snapped upward almost in unison, exactly as they had been trained to react against what looked like a renewed high-altitude threat. They had not climbed to survive. They had climbed to be seen. While both Pantsir turrets swung skyward, chasing the two decoys, the remaining UAVs in the low formation split into pairs and turned directly toward the two air defense vehicles themselves, no longer heading for the runway at all. Each Pantsir suddenly had a UAV closing in from a completely different direction than the one its radar and cannons were pointed at. The eastern battery reacted first, catching one incoming UAV with a burst of cannon fire that tore it apart less than 200 yards from the vehicle. But the second UAV used those same seconds to close from the opposite flank, and by the time the turret began rotating back, it was already too late. The impact struck the radar and fire control housing directly, and the resulting explosion silenced the Eastern Pantsir's 1RS-2-1E radar for good. On the western side of the base, nearly the same sequence played out only moments later. One incoming UAV shot down at close range, the second slipping through from an unguarded angle and detonating against the turret itself. Within less than 90 seconds, both of Belbek's dedicated point defense systems had gone dark, and there was nothing standing between the surviving UAVs and the parking apron where 12 freshly landed Su-35S fighters sat exposed under floodlights. At 0316 hours local time, word that both Pantsir batteries had been knocked out reached Belbek's base command, and the response that followed looked less like a modern air defense doctrine and more like a scene from an earlier era of warfare entirely. Ground crews and security troops poured out of shelters and bunkers with whatever they could carry. Some grabbed Igla shoulder-fired missiles, others fell in behind 12.7mm cord machine guns mounted on technical vehicles positioned around the perimeter, and dozens more simply opened fire with AK-74 rifles into the darkness above the runway, aiming at engine noise and silhouettes more than any confirmed target. The cords alone could put out roughly 750 rounds per minute each, and against a lightweight composite airframe carrying no armor whatsoever, even a single 12.7mm round finding an engine or control surface was enough to end a UAV's flight instantly. One Igla gunner found his mark early, the missile leaving the launch tube and accelerating past Mach 1.5 before striking a UAV just short of the perimeter fence, and it disappeared in a bright, brief flash. A second UAV took a burst of cord fire across one wing, rolled hard, and went down in a shallow ditch just outside the fence line without reaching the base at all. But by now, the range had closed to almost nothing, and even successful hits could no longer prevent debris and warhead fragments from landing somewhere inside the base perimeter. 7 of the remaining UAVs made it past the final wall of small arms and machine gun fire, and their targets, sitting in neat rows under the apron lighting, were now less than a few hundred yards ahead. The first UAV dove directly toward the nearest cluster of parked Su-35S, tracer fire from a nearby cord chasing it low across the tarmac and missing by less than a second. The impact struck the lead aircraft just behind the cockpit, and the explosion that followed tore through the fuselage and ignited fuel still loaded from the transfer flight only hours earlier, engulfing the jet in flame within seconds. The blast wave and flying debris damaged the 2 aircraft parked closest to it badly enough that ground crews would later confirm both were beyond economical repair. A second UAV, only a few seconds behind the first, struck a separate aircraft nearly head-on, and the resulting fire spread quickly enough that ground crews scrambling toward it with extinguishers were forced back by the heat before they could do anything meaningful. 2 more UAVs turned toward the fuel bowsers still parked near the apron from the earlier refueling operation, and the detonation that followed set off a secondary fireball that rolled across nearly 80 feet of open tarmac, catching a 5th aircraft at the edge of the blast radius and scorching its fuselage and one wing badly enough to ground it for weeks, even though the airframe itself technically survived. A 6th UAV, flying lower and slower than the others by this point, either battery drained or damaged by earlier fire, drifted off course and struck an empty support vehicle instead, doing little more than destroying a fuel truck that had, fortunately for Russia, already been emptied. The 7th and final UAV to make it through did not aim for the aircraft at all. It had been flying toward the base's ready-use munitions storage the entire time, a low, blast-walled structure set back from the main apron where bombs and air-to-air missiles for the newly arrived squadron had been staged only hours earlier in anticipation of the jets resuming combat sorties within days. The UAV dove into the storage area, and the first explosion was quickly followed by a much larger secondary detonation, as the munitions inside began cooking off in a chain reaction that shook windows more than half a mile away, and sent a column of fire and smoke rising over the base that was still visible from Ukrainian observation positions nearly 20 miles to the north. By the time the last echoes of secondary explosions faded and ground crews finally regained enough control of the fires to begin an accurate damage assessment, the numbers told a story Russian commanders had hoped never to write into a report. Of the 12 Su-35S that had landed only 2 hours earlier, 2 were confirmed completely destroyed. 3 more were damaged badly enough to require months of depot-level repair or outright write-off, and a 6th carried scorching and shrapnel damage serious enough to keep it grounded for an extended period, even after inspection. Maintenance crews called in from Sevastopol the following morning would spend nearly 3 days simply cataloging which airframes were worth attempting to repair at all. And initial estimates suggested that even the aircraft slated for repair would not return to operational status for at least 2 to 3 months, well past the window in which Russian commanders had hoped to use this squadron to contest Ukrainian strikes elsewhere on the peninsula. In the span of a single night, nearly half of a freshly arrived reinforcement squadron, aircraft meant to restore Russian air superiority over Crimea after a string of earlier losses, had been reduced to smoking wreckage or grounded hulks before a single one of them had flown a single combat sortie from their new base. Both Pantsir S-1 systems assigned to protect the apron were confirmed destroyed. The munitions storage building and its contents were a total loss, and Belbek's air defense commander now had to explain how an air base ringed by multiple, overlapping layers of modern Russian air defense had still lost nearly half its newest fighter squadron on the very first night those aircraft touched down. What makes this kind of strike so much more damaging to Russian planning than an ordinary drone raid is the patience baked into every part of it. Ukraine did not simply build a swarm and send it toward the nearest Russian airfield, hoping to get lucky. It tracked a specific squadron's transfer for nearly 2 weeks, understood exactly when those aircraft would be at their most vulnerable, and built a strike package specifically designed to exploit that one narrow window, when a fighter jet stops being a fast-moving threat in the sky and becomes nothing more than an expensive stationary target sitting in the open. Every layer of Belbek's defense, the S-350 battery-chasing decoys, the Pantsir systems fooled by electronic ghosts, the ground troops firing rifles into the dark, did exactly what it was designed to do against a conventional attack. None of it was built to withstand an enemy willing to trade dozens of $6,000 airframes for the chance to catch a $500 million squadron sitting still. That is the deeper cost Russia has to reckon with now. It is not just the 2 destroyed jets, the 3 or more written off, or the munitions depot that will take weeks to rebuild and restock. It is the fact that every future squadron transfer into Crimea now has to be treated as a moment of maximum vulnerability, one that Ukrainian reconnaissance may already be watching before the aircraft even leave their departure base. Reinforcing Crimea's air defense with more fighters was supposed to be the solution to Ukraine's early